Welcome. Today is the the seventh day of Tishrei, and the 9th of October. And we're looking at our article on wonders, which is the last article. It's about the Partsuf, the model of the 5 aspects of Yom Kippur. So yesterday we spent some time explaining what a model is, what a Partsuf is, how we work with it. As we describe this one and then the ones coming up, we'll get much more acquainted with this whole idea of comparing one better known model to another that's less well known and then learning from it. So just to review again, we said that in Maimonides, which is where we take our model that we're meditating on, considering, we find that in 3 different places he talks about 4 different aspects of Yom Kippur. And we said that these are the cessation from work, like on every Shabbat, the afflictions of the body, the most famous of which again is the fasting, not drinking and not eating. And then we have 2 more aspects, the tshuva, return to God, which also includes confession. And there's a lot to be said about the confessions that we say on Yom Kippur. And finally, we have the cleaving to God, connecting to God, being in one space with God. And that is achieved mostly through the prayers that we have, the whole day-long prayers that everybody participates in on Yom Kippur. So I just enumerated the 4 aspects in the reverse order of God's 4-letter name. So if you look at the article, which is on Patreon, patreon.com/Galeinai, Galeinai, you'll see that the 4 letters of God's name are Yud, He, and Vav and He. The last letter is the He, the second He. And so it corresponds to the cessation from work. But that's not all there is to it, because these 4 letters, they also correspond, and this is going to be our main object of comparison, our main model of comparison. These 4 letters correspond to what we call the 4 worlds. These are not worlds in the sense of a different place. They're not a different planet. They are worlds that exist in our reality, but they are usually explained, the best way to explain them is separate levels of consciousness, each one being higher than the other. So we have like 4 levels of consciousness that a person can be in, but that's not exactly correct, but I'll try to demonstrate this with a story. There was a Hasidic Rebbe, I don't remember who it was, I believe it was one of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's, and he took with him a relatively young student for a trip to some town, and they were discussing something, and he had trouble with how it could be that the same scenario could be understood in different ways. How does that exactly work? And the Rebbe said to him, it's very simple. It's like that we're now traveling to this town, and we all have a different understanding of why we're traveling. The horses that are drawing our buggy, they think we're traveling in order to get carrots and sugar at the end of the journey. The driver of the buggy, he thinks we're taking this trip in order for him to get paid when we reach our destination. You, he says, pointing to his student, you think that I took you along on this trip because I wanted to talk to you. And I have a completely different reason for why I'm doing this trip. So here you have the same situation with four completely different motivations behind it. And all of them are correct. The horses are right, the wagon driver is right, the student's right, and certainly the Rebbe is right. They don't discount anything from one or the other, but you will notice that they are ordered in a hierarchy, meaning that the real, we could say the deepest reason for this trip, the one who really moved everyone else, is the Rebbe and his reason for taking this trip. And the others are just kind of getting a fraction, a partial explanation of what this trip is about, but they don't touch the real reason. The same thing is true of our consciousness in these four worlds. So at the level of action, what we see around us, the actions that are happening in the world, and we try to understand why they're happening, they only reveal a very small picture or a very small explanation, partial explanation of why things are the way they are. Now you can get something out of it. It's not that it's completely wrong, but it's not certainly the full spectrum of why what is happening is happening. The same is true in the world that we call formation. Formation is a world of emotions usually, or speech sometimes. There too, when you look at people's emotions, you can get a certain understanding of what's going on. You can look at animals' emotions. You can look at many things. In fact, in early times, primitive times, everybody was at that level. Nobody was yet at the level of the world of creation that we'll talk about in a moment. Almost everyone was in the world of emotions. That's what you call a world of animism, where everything has an inner motivation. A landslide has an inner motivation. The tide coming in and going out, a hurricane like Milton. I wonder why they still call them by names. Well, they really call them by names because they want to differentiate between one and the other. But still, giving it, anthropomorphizing it, by giving it a human name, is like a remnant of the primitive world where everybody was an animist. And so everybody felt that everything had a soul. A soul in this sense was like a emotional, sympathetic response to its surroundings. Then you go to the world of creation, and there you have thought. And thought is a completely different motivation. This is like the student who thinks that the Rebbe's reason for taking this trip is so he could speak to me. That makes sense. It's not completely wrong. But obviously it's not everything. So thought already explains a lot more than emotions and actions do, but you can't really have a complete picture without all three of them. So they're called the three lower worlds: creation, formation, and action. The last world, the world of emanation, is the world where a person is conscious only of God. There's no consciousness of the actions conducted here by people. There's no consciousness of the emotions as being separate from God. You can be conscious of all of this, but it all appears as godly actions. There's no separate agents conducting the actions or feeling the emotions or thinking the thoughts. It's all godliness in the end. And that is the most complete picture of reality, and yet still there's higher levels even beyond that. But for now, these are the four basic worlds that the Kabbalists talk about. And we learned this from a verse in Isaiah who mentions the names of these four worlds. Kol asher, I won't mention it in Hebrew, it won't help us. In any case, emanation, creation, formation, and action in English. Now, let's go back to our first aspect of Yom Kippur, which is cessation from work. You can see how perfectly this fits with the lowest of the worlds, the second Hey in God's four-letter name, action. We cease our work, which means we cease certain types of actions. Not every action is considered work. And contrary to the way that people think about this, work has nothing to do with labor. It has nothing to do with how difficult something is. The 39 categories of work that the Torah identifies are related to the construction and the operation of the tabernacle, and they are considered to be the archetypal forms of things that change reality. They have to do with changing reality in some way, or, to say it the way that the Talmud says it, contributing to the further development of creation. They further the development. So on Shabbat and on Yom Kippur, we cease from these. We don't engage in continuing to perfect reality at the active level. We do it, but with our emotions and most of all with our thought. We continue to work, which is not really work. It may be very laborious, and you actually may sweat a lot more if you think long and hard. A very famous thing is that the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, when he used to pray, especially on Shabbat, his, what we call the shtreimel, the fur hat, sweated. It was so much heat coming from his mind that it was literally pouring out his sweat. So it can be very labor intensive in the sense of being hard work, but it's not a category of work to think. How do we even construct this? We say that on the seventh day, God stopped working. He stopped doing. He stopped acting. But he continues to sustain the world. The world doesn't disappear on the seventh day. He just stops perfecting it with the actions. Instead of perfecting it with the actions, God himself is described metaphorically as retreating from action back to thought. That's why we spend the Shabbat and also Yom Kippur engaged in our inner worlds of thought and emotion, because that's where everything is happening. There's another thing that we want to gain out of this, which is that this world of action is described in a verse from Psalms, which reads, God founded the earth with wisdom. I'm sorry, it's not from Psalms, it's from Proverbs, chapter 3, verse 19. What does it mean that God founded the earth with wisdom? What we have here is a verse that's describing the connection between the earth, which is the lowest of the worlds, the world of action, with wisdom. Wisdom is actually the sphera, the conduit of divine effluence that corresponds to the highest of the worlds, at least in our structure right now, the fourth world, which is called emanation. So God founded the earth with wisdom. What does that mean? It means that it is specifically in the world of action that we can find God's wisdom. Well, what is that? The idea here is that wisdom, when we talk about the experience of wisdom in a person, we see it as an experience of self-nullification. Wisdom is different than understanding. Understanding, and we've talked about this actually in the past, I don't know if you remember, we talked about this in relation to Jethro and his advice to Moses. And he told him you should find people who are wise, understanding, and well-known. And we explained there that the difference between being wise and being understanding is that the person who is understanding is someone who takes what he's already learned, what he's already been given, and develops it further. That's called understanding. In Hebrew, that's called bina. And a lot of times, bina, understanding, is described as understanding one thing from another. So I've been given something, and I understand something new from it. This is usually what we call deduction, deductive logic. We take a statement that we know is true, and we try to deduce from it new statements. Wisdom, on the other hand, is being open to receiving new knowledge. Not knowledge that I will develop, not knowledge that I will do something with. Rather, knowledge that I will receive from somewhere else, from someone else. To be able to, for instance, for anybody who's watching this and has grown bored, you have to exercise self-restraint and self-nullification to continue to listen. It's very tough. It's one of the things that our generation is very challenged by, which is why students in a classroom no longer have any patience to hear the teacher. Because either you're super entertaining, in which case, okay, I'll give you the benefit of listening to you, or you have to be someone who's so scary that I will recede and not bother you. And that's why discipline is so difficult in a classroom today. That's why people really want to control what's being said, so they prefer to listen to it on YouTube or TikTok or whatever it is, because they don't want to be in a state of self-nullification. They want to be in control. But self-nullification is what Solomon calls the key to being able to learn something from anyone. You can learn something even from fools if you have enough self-nullification and you have enough sense to be able to tell the difference between something that's valuable and something that's not. But if you're not patient enough, you don't have enough nullification of the self to be able to listen out what they have to say, you'll miss the nuggets of wisdom that are everywhere. So now we're saying that wisdom appears in action, in the world of action. And the idea here is that by ceasing from work, what does it mean to cease from work? Our nature is to do work. Man was born to toil. We all toil. And actually the people who don't have patience are the people who are toiling in some way. Either their mind's racing, their heart's racing, or their fantasy world is racing. But something's going on. They're not listening, not because they have no listening apparatus. They're not listening because they're doing something else. To cease from work is to discover the world of emanation within the world of action. That's called God founded the earth, again, the world of action, with wisdom. If you have this ability to first think before you leap, listen before you answer, then your world of action is full of godliness. With this, we'll end today, and hopefully tomorrow we'll finish the last three aspects of Yom Kippur, and we won't be able to meet on Friday. Erev Yom Kippur is very tight, and so hope to see you tomorrow. All the best, everyone.